professor of history at Western Washington University. And I think he wins the award actually from East and West as coming the furthest, because his home base is the furthest west, and he flew in from Italy yesterday. So that's the furthest east, right? I think so. He wins the travel award. His research focuses on social and economic history in early Mesopotamia. This past year, he received the Outstanding Faculty Leadership Award at Western. He's a member of the board of directors for the International Association of Syriology and the American Oriental Society. He has authored and edited several books, including Entrepreneur's Enterprise in Early Mesopotamia, and he's the editor of the Journal of the Ancient Near East History. And those are just my crib notes from a much larger array of accomplishments and awards. So let's welcome Professor Garfield.
You're very kind. Thank you so much, Tara. And let me first say, I'm going to assume there's no trouble hearing me, because the loudest place in my department is the office next door to mine. Now, I want to thank you all for having me. And this is an exciting opportunity for me, I should say, for three reasons. As a historian, I want to dig into what brings me here. So first of all, I should say that many years ago, more years ago than either of us would like to acknowledge, I actually took a seminar from Professor Bullitt when I was a grad student at Columbia. So it's particularly fun to follow that. I also did a significant amount of my doctoral research in the Babylonian collection, which I understand you visited yesterday. But the best reason I have for being here is that at Western, we do an awful lot of training of social studies teachers. In fact, a significant percentage of our major is future teachers like yourself. So I feel accustomed to speaking to an audience of future teachers. It's actually fun to catch an audience where you've already been out and doing it, because my students are all on the way. And some of them, I have to say, and I apologize in advance for your middle school teachers, some of them eager to teach middle school, which is the one thing that I've never quite understood. Middle schoolers are scary. Now, I should also say Professor Bullitt's presentation is a really good springboard for a lot of what I have to say. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about wheels. I will perhaps talk a little bit more about animals. This might be the half-assed part of the day. And you know, much of what he said, as I mentioned, forms a really good background to some of the points that I'm going to make. I also may offer some slightly differing interpretations of the Mesopotamian material. So, cities, as you well know, since you're all here for this particular institute, were the building blocks of civilization in early Mesopotamia. The great cities built on the alluvial plain of the Tigris and Euphrates River were the most prominent features of the landscape. And this was certainly true physically. The cities themselves stood out above the relatively flat landscape in Mesopotamia and provided people with their most visible landmarks. And I like to highlight that because we live in a world where, for many of us, natural phenomenon are the obvious landmarks, and we think of man-made phenomenon as being a much more of a feature of the modern landscape, whereas if we go back to ancient Mesopotamia, it was the man-made phenomenon, once cities had been built on the plains of Mesopotamia, that were its most prominent features. Indeed, from at least the late 4th millennium BC onwards, the walls of one city on a clear day would often be the most visible feature on the horizon from another city. And I bring this up to remind us how much a part of the Mesopotamian consciousness urban environments were. Politically, ideologically, socially, cities, and here we should look at least the concentration of some of those cities down in southern Mesopotamia, and I'll come back to this. Politically, ideologically, socially, and economically, cities were at the center of the ancient Mesopotamian imagination, and they were at the center of daily life. My focus today is primarily on the last of these aspects of society, economic life in ancient Mesopotamian cities. But throughout, I'm going to connect trade and commerce directly with these other areas, especially as they relate to development of the state and to larger notions of political community. Now, the prominence of cities is clearly evidenced in the surviving documentary record in ancient Mesopotamia. The most famous literary work from ancient Mesopotamia highlights these points. That's what I wanted. The Epic of Gilgamesh begins with a description of the walls of the great city of Uruk. Uruk's prominence in the epic, and you can see here not only the description of its walls, but the notation that these 7 sages, these ancient mythical figures of Mesopotamia, credited with the production of so much knowledge, had actually laid the foundations of the walls of what was early on one of its greatest cities. Uruk's prominence in the Epic of Gilgamesh mirrored its original significance in the region. By 3000 BC, Uruk was the largest city in the Near East and probably the largest city in the world at that time. And this is a fun sort of comparative map to look at. You see Uruk on the upper left. What this image shows is the walled size of a bunch of different cities snapshotted in the eras of their great prominence. So you see Athens on the top right, just on the verge of the wars against the Persians. Rome, the lower right, during the time of the so-called Pax Romana. Jerusalem on the lower left, the time of Herod. And up there on the upper left, our city of Uruk. And you can see that in terms of its walled size, in 3000 BC, Uruk was already twice the area that Athens would be roughly 2,500 years later, and essentially half the size that Rome would be 3,000 years later. Now, just to be clear, we're talking about area here, not population. Population density was less. But Uruk at this time was probably the largest city in the world. It almost certainly was the actual place, as far as we know, where writing was invented. And as a historian, I'll depart a little bit from the discussions of the wheel and the steam engine and the other stuff that came in the last presentation and say that writing was the greatest invention. And as history teachers, we'd be nowhere without the written record. And so Uruk at this time gave birth to the historical periods of world history. And to return to the Epic of Gilgamesh, the epic not only highlights the grandeur of urban civilization, but it highlights the place of the city as the locus of civilization. This is most clear in the epic when Enkidu, the wild man from the steppe, is being brought into the city, is being slowly introduced to civilization, and he's told, "Come, I will lead you to Uruk, the town square, to the sacred temple, to the home of Anu. Enkidu, arise, let me take you to the temple of Eanna, the home of Anu, where men are engaged in labors of skill, and you too, like a man, will find a place for yourself." And the text insists that people can only really be people if they live in a city. And that within that city, men find places for themselves. And I'd highlight, because this sets up a lot of my discussion later on, the focus really is here on socioeconomic places, and indeed ultimately on notions of craft specialization. In the city, men are engaged in different labors, in different skills. That's where people will find a place for themselves, and find a place for themselves in what was, as I'll come back to, a very hierarchical community, characterized by tremendous not only craft specialization, but also social hierarchy and differentiation. And I should also acknowledge here that this is really a focus in the epic, at least in this part of the epic, on men. This is not surprising in such an unapologetically patriarchal society as ancient Mesopotamia, but we should acknowledge in the text the clear focus on, in many respects, the activities of men. And that's not to exclude women from the discussion in any way, but it's to acknowledge the problem in our original source material, that the focus is so much on what men do in the urban environment. Now, before moving more specifically to the topic of what went on in these ancient cities, commerce, trade, the stuff of daily life that is really the focus of my presentation, I want to give you a sense as teachers of some of the other resources that are out there for you for the study of ancient Mesopotamia. As you know, ancient Mesopotamia today is located almost entirely within the modern nation of Iraq, and the unstable situation in Iraq has been a calamity for the survival of its ancient cities, some of which have become casualties now of several wars in the region. At the same time, to strike at least a somewhat hopeful note, excavation is beginning again in southern Iraq. And in fact, I saw a presentation not long ago on the new excavations at the ancient city of Ur. So we can now look forward to reports of new archaeological evidence. In the meantime, though, as teachers, there are a lot of places you can go online to find some really neat Mesopotamian things and things that you can give to your students. The first of them, my favorite, the British Museum. I should mention, only fair to point out, there's nothing British in the British Museum. I don't know if any of you have been there. It's one of the remarkably named institutions of the world. If it was called the Museum of British Colonialism, the closest the British Museum gets to British objects is its collection of Roman artifacts found in Britain. So the detritus of a former era of colonizers. But the British Museum is, though, one of the best places to go. And in fact, if you just go to right there, I think it's just britishmuseum.org. You can do an object search, and they have an enormous number of objects from ancient Mesopotamia that provide really a wealth of information about daily life, about what went on in these cities. And the British Museum is kind enough to let you use those images. So you can actually download really high quality images as long as you agree that you're only using them for teaching or other individual purposes and aren't going to sell them as postcards. Now, the next place I would suggest, and this is a much more cumbersome website because it's an older one and not one that's constantly maintained, is something called, rather awkwardly, the Electronic Text Corpus of Sumerian Literature. Fortunately, there's nothing else online that is ETCSL. So if you just put in a Google search for ETCSL, you get this rather antiquated website. But what's neat is it has English translations of any number of the earliest mythical and literary texts that we have in the written record. All of the different stories and texts from early Mesopotamia are provided here in English translation. Totally open access, and you can give these straight to your students, send them to look at this. It's an excellent place. The last one I'll mention, also I think awkwardly named, is ORAC, the Open Richly Annotated Cuneiform Corpus. Again, there's nothing else online that is ORACC. This is actually a wealth of information. If you click on the projects here, this collects all of the open source projects online that deal with the cuneiform text from ancient Mesopotamia. And a particular favorite of mine, and of some visitors perhaps in the room, if you go down, you can find virtually everything from, I'll get there eventually, the Neo-Assyrian period, which was mentioned briefly in Professor Bullitt's presentation. And you get here again open access available English translations of the very famous Neo-Assyrian inscriptions, some of which mirror the biblical texts, letters that you can look at from ancient kings to their ministers, from people and functionaries in their kingdoms back to them. And these are just some really good, totally open source, useful places to go online or to send your students online if you want them to look at ancient Mesopotamia in a little bit more detail. Now, coming back to Mesopotamia, which I always like to do, I want to briefly talk about the physical environment. And Professor Bullitt, again, talked a little bit about this in the last presentation, because it's the physical environment that sets the stage both for the urban revolution that took place in Mesopotamia and for the development of commerce, and in particular long-distance trade that I'm going to be talking about. It's a hallmark of southern Mesopotamia, usually called in your textbooks the cradle of civilization, that it lacked rain. This is a nice map showing all of the really healthy, I'm told purple. I have to confess to color blindness here. I like this map, even though it's in color. You've got all those really nice purple places outside of Mesopotamia, in the Fertile Crescent that surrounded Mesopotamia, where agriculture and animal husbandry first developed. Here's our introduction of agriculture map. I like, at least with my introductory students, to call this the map of the Fertile Toucan rather than the Fertile Crescent, because it just reminds me of the guy in the Fruit Loops box. The densest pattern in there, which you see, is the place where agriculture and animal husbandry first developed. The domestication of plants and animals in the Fertile Crescent made possible the development of cities on the plains of Mesopotamia. And that's why agriculture comes later to Mesopotamia. Now, in keeping with what Professor Bullitt said, I actually want to talk a little bit throughout this presentation about the importance of animal husbandry, because I think it's difficult to overstate the importance of animal husbandry in the early cities of Mesopotamia, and yet I think it's often ignored. And it's ignored with an emphasis on grain or cereal productivity. This area, which was extraordinarily productive, is usually credited with all of these wonderful original things in supposed civilization because of its agricultural productivity. But the animal side of that often gets ignored. Now, certainly, the area was very productive for grain agriculture, for cereal agriculture. We estimate, based on ancient texts from various places where they give the yield on fields, that the average acre or hectare of land in southern Mesopotamia was between 4 and 10 times more productive than on a similar plot, for example, in ancient Greece, which actually had land that was relatively unproductive by comparison. But this focus on grain ignores the importance of animals. And in many ways, it's the animals that drove commerce. And you can see on the top here how many of those important animals that we still depend on in many ways in the modern world were first domesticated in the ancient Near East. And here, by the way, I'll depart from what Professor Bullitt said. The donkey, the fully domesticated, not half-assed, not half-wild, offshoot of the wild ass, of the onager about which he spoke, was a very prominent part of Mesopotamian civilization from very early on. And the textual evidence makes clear the extent to which they relied on domesticated donkeys as primary draft animals. And I'll come back to that in a few moments. But more importantly, especially where sheep and goat are concerned, the very sophisticated industries that arose in ancient Mesopotamia that allowed for tremendous commerce to develop among the ancient cities of Mesopotamia owed its basis to industries that relied on animal husbandry, and in particular, the textile industry. Now, it's also by now, and I'm sure in the textbooks that you're using, something of a truism to note that Mesopotamia lacked most natural resources beyond land, water, and reeds. This can really be seen on this map, where the area I'm talking about today, southern Mesopotamia, seems to have nothing. And this is a very common theme. In fact, stone, metal, and significant wood for building were largely absent from the ancient Mesopotamian environment. The engagement in long-distance trade by these ancient urbanites is usually ascribed to their need to look elsewhere for these types of resources. This is certainly true. But, and this is one of the readings that I think that Sam will have distributed to you, an article that I gave to you by a historian at Columbia by the name of Mark van der Meeroop points out that the ancient Mesopotamians didn't actually need any of those things from the outside world in order to be self-sufficient. That the productivity of the Mesopotamian environment in terms of agriculture, farming, animal husbandry, the availability of building materials, maybe not the best building materials, but the availability of building materials, in particular the mud bricks, which, as Professor Bullitt pointed out, the Mesopotamians used to build virtually everything. All of that was there. And in fact, long-distance trade arose in Mesopotamia alongside increasing social stratification. That is, in these ancient cities, as social hierarchies developed and became more embedded, as elites looked for ways to demonstrate and perform in many ways their new elite status, they looked outside of Mesopotamia for many of the luxury commodities that became necessary for elite consumption. And this took place across a really broad urbanized environment. So here's a good map showing many of the most important cities of early Mesopotamia, certainly not all of them, but you can see how densely populated this relatively small area of what is now modern Iraq was by ancient cities. By the way, this here shows what we think is the approximate ancient coastline. One of the big differences between modern Iraq and ancient Mesopotamia is the fact that the coastline was much more inland. And a lot of the major cities of ancient Mesopotamia, cities like Ur, were actually coastal seaports connected directly to the Persian Gulf. And I'll come back to the trade that they engaged in throughout the Persian Gulf and beyond in a little while. But it's important to recognize many of these cities located right on the coastline. You can see from this just how densely populated with cities ancient Mesopotamia was, and in those cities what you had from the period of the beginning of the urban revolution onward was a growth in social sophistication, social stratification, the growth of a relatively small group of elites who dominated the control of the economy in these ancient cities, and they looked for ways to perform, as I mentioned a moment ago, that status. And this is really important both in terms of its consequences for commerce and daily life, as well as for state development. Not only did these elites drive trade in ancient Mesopotamia, but our evidence also very much restricts much of our attention to those elites. The majority of our historical and archaeological evidence was produced by or for wealthy individuals at the very top of, I'll call it, borrowing from the Egyptians, the pyramid of this ancient society. I should say the ziggurat of this ancient society, but students are always going to be more familiar with pyramids. Now, in the period that I'm going to focus on today, which is the Bronze Age in Mesopotamia, and in terms of dates, that's roughly from the end of the 4th millennium, let's say 3200 BC, 3000 BC, down to around 1200 BC. And in the second half of this presentation, I'm going to focus closely on examples from a couple of archives from the 2nd millennium BC to illustrate these themes of commerce and daily life. But we need to remember always that these archives often only provide first-hand knowledge about a small percentage of the ancient population. And much of the ancient population, in terms of what they thought about the society they lived in, is hidden from our view. Now, one of the earliest surviving objects that richly details this, and which I'm going to assume many of you have seen before, comes again from the city of Uruk, and it's known to archaeologists and historians as the Uruk vase. It dates to the late 4th millennium BC, dates to around the same time that writing was being invented in the city of Uruk. Happens to be an object with a troubled modern history as well. Some of you may know that this is one of the more famous objects initially stolen from the Baghdad Museum following the invasion of Iraq in the spring of 2003. And it also is one of the more famous objects that was returned to the museum. It was returned in pieces and had to be restored in the modern era a second time. The neat thing about the vase, or at least the neat thing I'm going to use the vase for, is to show more or less in a vertical demonstration of the hierarchy, this pyramid of society that I alluded to a moment ago. The vase itself seems to represent, from bottom to top, a very Mesopotamian understanding of the world that they lived in. The very bottom of the object, and I apologize if the images aren't particularly good, you see some sort of crop growing in the fields, grain, flax. I don't know that any of us are enough of an expert on early Mesopotamian iconography for plants, for the flora of Mesopotamia, to know exactly what it is. But it shows those plants. Now, they're resting on the water, which of course is the foundation of life in Mesopotamia. And here I'll echo a point that Professor Bullitt made, and I'll come back to it in more detail. Water routes were much more important to the Mesopotamians than land routes. The rivers, the canals that connected the Mesopotamian cities to each other were much more important in many ways, but particularly as well for trade and communication than overland routes. And for all of the reasons that Professor Bullitt talked about. Overland trade is significantly less efficient than seaborne trade or waterborne trade, particularly in antiquity. So you've got water as the foundation of society, then the cereal productivity of the land, then the animals. And we can see here, one of the reasons I'm highlighting the animals, Mesopotamians did so themselves. The animals are next up in this, what I'm suggesting is a hierarchy of their worldview of what we might call the daily economy that supported their societies. Water, plants, animals. And then above that, we finally get people. And our first group of people, first of all, it's tough to tell them apart. One thing we can say about them, and the image allows us to say this, they're all men. They're all naked. They're not particularly well differentiated from each other. But what they're doing is carrying the agricultural productivity of this community. They're carrying it somewhere. We see in the next register up where they're carrying it. But we see here already the kind of emphasis that we got in a very different context from the Epic of Gilgamesh, where Enkidu is told, come live in the city where you too, like a man, can be engaged in labors of skill. These people are engaged in labor, some of it undoubtedly very oppressive manual labor, but they're bringing in the various produce of that labor and delivering it up top to the big people in the center. And this is one of the remarkable things about Mesopotamian visual iconography about status and place in society. The more important people are quite literally bigger. And not, let me hasten to add, because they were, but because that's the way they were understood in society. They played a bigger role in the community. And so here we see the sort of socio and economic organization of Mesopotamian society in one alabaster vase from, roughly 5,000 years ago, where they demonstrate the way that they organize their society. The ancient Mesopotamian economy was very much what economic historians call a redistributive economy. For the most part, the state, however we want to understand that, and I'll come back to that in a little while, owned most of the means of production. The people worked those means of production, and they were under an obligation to deliver most of the produce of their labor to the state, which then redistributed it outward. Unless we imagine this as some sort of early utopia, the way I usually frame this redistributive economy for my students is that these people at the top had organized a system in which from each as much as they could take, back to them as little as they had to. Now, that's undoubtedly a slight exaggeration, but I'd suggest, based on the economic evidence from early Mesopotamia, only a slight exaggeration. Most of the people worked the land, they worked crafts, they worked on behalf of the elites in their community, who then had the responsibility of deciding what would happen to all of that stuff. And what happened to all of that stuff was that a lot of it got collected in the center. A lot of it, in fact, the majority of it was used locally to feed the population, to provide rations for the laborers who were working in the fields, who were at other times of the year fixing the walls of the city, about which Gilgamesh is so proud in the Epic of Gilgamesh. They were also producing rich textiles and other manufactured goods that those elites could then trade with the outside world to collect the really valuable objects that, as the article that I distributed to you by Mark Vandermeer points out, allowed them to demonstrate their status. The long-distance trade in luxury commodities is really apparent in the early archaeological record. These are objects found in the royal tombs, the cemetery at Ur. They date to around, let's say, 2600 BC. And here we see direct information not only about the trade routes that brought in precious materials, like the lapis lazuli beads you see over here, which would have come all the way from what is today modern Afghanistan. But it also shows us a little bit about the industries that crafted those materials into objects like these. These images and the next one that we'll look at, as I mentioned, date to the end of the first half of the 3rd millennium BC, let's say 2600 BC. And this is also squarely in the middle of an era that historians today call the early dynastic period. That is the period during which dynastic kingship became the dominant norm for governing the ancient city-states in Mesopotamia. And I'll return to an object we've already seen today, we see the same sort of imagery echoed on the standard of Ur that we were just looking at a moment ago on the Uruk vase. Here you see again people and animals bringing in stuff. Stuff's kind of the technical term I'm going to use for everything they're carrying. And it's everything that's produced in this extraordinarily rich agricultural environment in Mesopotamia. And they bring it in to the people at the center. And you can see once again the elites, and here we see more of them than we saw in the Standard of Ur. The elites are, again, quite simply bigger than the rest of them. On that top register, you've got harpists and serving people, bringing these elites something to drink, presumably something to eat at this festival they're having. Standing up, they're as tall as those people are sitting down. And the king himself, over here on the left, is so tall that his head busts through the ceiling. Now, in this, we see again the same sort of demonstration of how the elites at the top of society organized local productivity to have the surplus brought into the center. And then this object again demonstrates how they used that surplus to organize long-distance trade to bring in luxury goods. A lot of the Standard of Ur is again made of precious materials that come from as far away as Afghanistan. Now, the object has two sides. You've already seen a close-up of part of what we call, very creatively, the war side. Here I'll disagree with Professor Bullitt. It's very clear that these, as he called them, war wagons, were used in war. It doesn't matter that they only went forward. By the way, no self-respecting general goes any other direction. But more importantly, if we think about what they're used for, they're used actually to mirror the social stratification that I've been talking about. Their purpose wasn't like the chariots of fun modern movies about ancient Rome to race around at high speeds. Their purpose, drawn by donkeys, the domesticated donkeys that the Mesopotamians used for so many purposes, they were drawn by donkeys ponderously, slowly, elaborately onto the battlefield so that the elites could stand taller than everyone else. And I'd suggest, Professor Bullitt's certainly right, they don't have, at this point, bow and arrow in use. They're using javelin. I haven't actually thrown a javelin, but I'm pretty certain that height is an advantage in doing so. And being brought onto the battlefield in this way not only mirrored the social hierarchy that we see here below, the big people actually standing taller on the battlefield, it also certainly gave them an advantage. And certainly an advantage over anybody who didn't have one of these mobile platforms to stand on top of. And if we wonder about what happened to the poor donkeys, I think we have to assume bad things always happen to donkeys in the ancient Near East. And I should point out, these donkeys are not being drawn by the sort of bit and bridle that is a later development. Most of them were being guided through nose rings, and so we can imagine this was a rather unpleasant experience for the donkeys all around. This object, again, mirrors not only the social stratification of ancient Mesopotamia, but also its economic organization. And it mirrors, as I'm going to come back to, some of the responsibilities that royal authority, the king there in the center. And in fact, in that image on the top, the king's chariot on the left is absent of its war materials because the war is over. The king is in the center, again, his head crashing through the ceiling, actually receiving the surrender of the enemy soldiers, or at least reviewing the enemy prisoners. So by the top of this scene, the war's over, and I presume they're ready to turn around again and party. Now, what we see in these images is the growing symbolic power of kingship. And this was matched by the growth of central administrative authority. As I mentioned earlier, writing was likely invented in the city of Uruk. It certainly was invented in southern Mesopotamia in the second half of the 4th millennium BC. And it was invented largely to track the ownership and delivery of economic goods. We would love to think writing was invented to capture the whimsy or the wonder of poetry, literature, etc. Writing was invented for accountants. It's a grim reality. As an economic historian who does a lot of accounting history, doesn't seem grim to me, but I recognize it's not an exciting tale. But writing developed to track the ownership and delivery of goods. Here you see a couple examples of early tablets. Again, these are fine pictures that you can download without copyright infringement from the British Museum, including on the upper right a cylinder seal also from their collection, just to show the way in which they used different technologies at that time to control and track the delivery of goods. The development of writing was part of a growth in craft specialization in these early cities that included an increased sophistication across the board, both economically and administratively. The growth in industries like metalworking and textile production were matched by the proliferation of administrative roles, particularly among the elite, including those that required the specialized knowledge of scribes. And here is a fun example of that specialized knowledge. This tablet actually is housed in the Raritan Manuscript Collection of Columbia University Library. I don't think they're actually as free with their copyright, but I show it anyway. The fun thing about this is a mathematical tablet from the early 2nd millennium BC, dates to around 1800. And what it actually shows is a series of what mathematicians call Pythagorean triples. This is essentially the proof of the Pythagorean theorem, roughly 1300 years before Pythagoras was born. What it shows us is the way that these early cities in ancient Mesopotamia were centers for the production of knowledge. And I want to highlight that that knowledge was a direct outgrowth of an increase in trade in these cities and its sophistication. A growth in the need to keep track of stuff led to significant advances in mathematical knowledge. Writing gave the ancient administrators, the people who worked for the guys whose head burst through the ceiling, a greater tool to manage the economy. And this led to a dynamic increase in record keeping. Such record keeping provides us as historians with extraordinarily detailed information about daily life in these ancient cities, often down to a minute level. Now again, very much focused on the concerns of the elite. But to give you an example, in the late 3rd millennium BC, let's say around the 21st century BC, which is the 100 years I like best in all the world. I tell my colleagues in my history department back home that I'm the first 21st century historian they ever hired, but it's not the 21st century most of them are thinking of. 21st century BC happened to be an era where there was a proliferation in record keeping, and a lot of that survives. It's so detailed that, for example, in the city of Ur, there's an archive that survives from a craft workshop where we can document the daily productivity of that craft workshop for every day of a single year. So for 4,000 years ago, we can measure what was produced, by the way, primarily for an elite audience, fancy statues, important or very expensive articles of clothing, leather work, etc. But you can observe this today on almost a daily level for 4,000 years ago. So often down to a minute level of detail, they kept records. And our knowledge is further enhanced because the tool of writing also gave other professionals who managed trade on behalf of the crown, on behalf of the state, a way to better track their own business. In all of these early ancient cities, merchants were part of the craft specialization that took place. Groups of merchants developed from very early on to manage the trade in locally bulk commodities. What we have to imagine about this redistributive network of ancient Mesopotamia, the big institutions, palaces, temples, great estates, were bringing enormous amounts of bulk commodities, raw wool, lots of grain, etc., all of which needed to be processed into usable commodities, bread, other types of foodstuffs, beer in particular, textiles, etc. All of that then had to be either distributed or sold. And the way that the great estates of the time were able to acquire the other luxury goods that they wanted was by selling it. It was merchants who handled those sales. Each of the ancient cities had a complex local economy based on farming and animal husbandry. The great institutions collected an enormous amount of bulk commodities that they then needed to exchange for other goods. And here, I'll really echo where Professor Bullitt started. One of the key factors to recognize about ancient Mesopotamia is that its cereal agricultural productivity did not lead directly for trade. It may have been an enormous engine for local population growth, but it couldn't facilitate long-distance trade because they couldn't ship grain in bulk anywhere. The reality is, overland, and again, The donkey is the most frequently used pack animal in ancient Mesopotamia other than people. And very quickly, if you load donkeys or people with grain, very quickly they eat more than they can carry, and they can't carry it effectively over long distances. Not only that, the Mesopotamian environment wasn't particularly conducive to trade on the rivers other than going downriver or going across. One of the big differences between the Mesopotamian River Valley and, for example, the Nile River Valley is the Mesopotamian River Valley is what I would describe more or less as a one-way system. Things went downriver. Now, obviously there are exceptions. But whereas in ancient Egypt, the Nile River's flow is always from south to north, but the prevailing winds in the valley are always blowing in the opposite direction from north to south, so that it's rapidly transited in both directions. That's not true for ancient Mesopotamia. And in terms of the effect that this has on history, one of the things to think about, if you think about the broad sweep of Mesopotamian history, from Sumerians to Babylonians, later on to the Assyrians, keep in mind, political power continually moves northward. That's not an accident, or really what I should say is it moves upriver. And that's not an accident, because controlling the waterways ultimately becomes very important as a key tool of political control and manipulation in this environment. But it also means you're not trading all of that wonderful bounty of barley that was grown around these Mesopotamian cities over long distances. That made the work of merchants very important, both locally for the management of that small regional economy, taking those bulk products, turning them into other products that were more portable, more saleable, things like textiles, in many cases precious metal, and then organizing the long-distance trade to bring in the desirable commodities that came from outside of ancient Mesopotamia. Now, the work of these merchants also relied, from very, very early on the establishment of what we might call a regulatory environment by local political authorities. And here I'll just highlight as an example the importance of weights, measures, and calendars. Reliable and agreed upon and enforceable weights and measures, as well as calendars, facilitated commercial transactions, from sales to loans, that were required in these cities. These began as local systems, often unique to each city. In fact, in the early historical evidence, we know that cities that oftentimes were within sight of one another had different local calendars and different systems of weights and measures. But within their local economy, they used a uniform system of weights and measures. And in fact, this made the early work of merchants even more important, because their ability to work across these systems was part of their professional expertise. Their ability, to put it in modern terms, to translate the shekel of Uruk into the shekel of Eson, like trading pounds for dollars, though that's a bad idea right now. This is part of the professional knowledge that these ancient merchants had to have. And the growth of cities and of commerce throughout southern Mesopotamia ultimately then led to conflict amongst these different cities over both resources and over these, what I'm calling, regulatory systems. We see this, by the way, in one of our earliest examples of historical conflict documented. Here we have what is probably the earliest historical narrative that talks about both interstate conflict and ideas of just war. It's the very famous war between two ancient Mesopotamian cities, the cities of Lagash and Umma. This city here, Girsu, was part of Lagash. These were neighbors. What you see here is ultimately they're fighting over land. A boundary marker had been set up between these two states. One state, in this case the enemy, formed a plan to seize that field, broke the boundary marker, advanced on the enemy. The enemy, armed with divine right, responds. But the essence of this conflict is over both local resources and their necessity as engines of growth for both regional trade and long-distance trade, and the growing importance of a need for greater, what I'm calling, regulatory authority. The need for authority to mediate conflict and ultimately to provide for more efficient trade amongst these early states led in part to a process that historians and anthropologists call secondary state formation. When the city-states merge into larger political units, when larger ideas of political community come along. Now, the earliest evidence we have for the successful implementation of this larger idea of community comes from the dynasty of Sargon of Akkad, who's oftentimes called the world's first imperialist. That's, in my view, too grand a claim. But he certainly was the first person to bring all of the cities of southern Mesopotamia together under one political organization. He created a kingdom that controlled that whole city. This actually is an inscription on the left from one of his sons. This is an image on the right of his grandson Naram-Sin. You can see how grandly the idea of kingship has grown. He's now not just bigger than everybody else, but he's half the size of the mountain. The important thing here is what you can see is that kings are not only taking a more direct role in warfare. Much of this inscription is about warfare, the smiting of cities, but it's also about guaranteeing access to trade and commodities. Manishtushu, a son of Sargon, says that not only did he defeat these enemies across the lower sea is the Persian Gulf, but that he quarried the black stone of the mountains on the other side of the lower sea, loaded it into boats, and moored them at the wharf of Akkad. And we can see how the growth of state authority leads to increased trade, increased productivity, and also larger notions of regulatory authority. One of the other great contributions credited to Sargon and his dynasty for Mesopotamia was an attempt to create statewide standardization of weights, measures, scribal practices. And these are all improvements that become a trope in the claims of early kings of Mesopotamia. Among the good things we provide for you are weights and measures you can trust, calendars you can believe in, other kinds of things that are going to facilitate trade both within the cities of Mesopotamia and allow those traders to better do their job outside of the cities. Now, the most visible of these developments, both in the historical record and in our modern imagination, and in terms of its impact on commerce, was the creation of statewide legal systems. The so-called law codes of early Mesopotamia, of which Hammurabi's code is the most famous, but certainly not the first, sum up both the concerns of everyday life and those of growing state authority. The example here comes from that last century of the 3rd millennium BC, the 21st century BC, again, the best 100 years in all of history. And it shows exactly what's happening. At that time, the city of Ur, down in southern Mesopotamia, had become the regional power. Ur controlled all of southern Mesopotamia. And what did its kings do for the people? As it says here, I did not deliver the orphan to the rich. I did not deliver the widow to the mighty. I did not deliver the man with but 1 shekel to the man with 1 mina. I did not deliver the man with but 1 sheep to the man with 1 ox. Now, by the way, this is, for ancient Mesopotamia, as close as we get to a discussion of the 1%. A mina, an ancient unit of weight and measure in Mesopotamia, was made up of 60 shekels. So what this is saying is I didn't give the man of 1 shekel to the man of 60 shekels. Not quite 1%, but we're getting close. Now, the remarkable thing about a document like this, and the king then goes on to say, and wouldn't this be wonderful, I eliminated enmity, violence, and cries for justice. One of the remarkable things about these documents, though, is that what they do first and foremost is protect the property of the wealthy elites. The prologue to something like this law code, the prologue to Hammurabi's law code, make grand claims to justice, to protecting the weak, to protecting the man of 1 shekel from the man of 1 mina. If you then read on in the text, mostly what it says is, don't take anything that's not yours, or the weight of the state will come down on you very, very forcefully. And that's critical to the operation of commerce in these communities. In fact, we tend to think based on how we in the modern West view the relationship between individuals and the state. We tended to think of the state as being somewhat antithetical to the operation of private property. In fact, history of private property says the opposite. Private property wants the state. Individuals of property in the community need the state. Merchants, first and foremost, have to have the state to enforce the standards on which trade is based in these early communities. Now, after a period of unity under, for example, this king and his dynasty, the Mesopotamian world fragmented in the early second millennium for the last time into a number of small kingdoms. Here's just a colorful example of that continued to vie for control of the region. And from this same era, we also begin to get really detailed commercial records from across Mesopotamia, not only in the south, but also in the north. Up here, in what is here the kingdom of Shemshi-Adad, we see in the center the city of Ashur. That area, which I think is brown, is that more or less right? Yeah. Something like that. In that area, that's the place that later on would develop into the great kingdom and empire of Assyria. But in the beginning of its history, the city of Ashur was a relatively small city-state at the center of several really important trade routes connecting the whole of this ancient world. In fact, connecting areas as far away as modern Iran with the eastern Mediterranean coastline with central Turkey. The city of Ashur in the early second millennium BC managed a long-distance trade network that connected families of merchants in the city of Ashur with their representatives and family members stationed all the way up in areas that are today in central Turkey in order to manage long-distance trade between these regions. By the way, a trade that existed more or less on the backs of donkeys. In the early second millennium, this trade was so important and so lucrative that the journey from Ashur to Kanesh meant that a lot of goods were traveling on the backs of donkeys and not the people. We know that the people actually walked because the space on the backs of the donkeys was too valuable for them. So the people walked next to the donkeys, and the donkeys carried precious materials, particularly textiles, oftentimes manufactured back down here in southern Mesopotamia, traded up here into Ashur, and then sent over great distances into Kanesh. And what came back was quite often copper and silver. And it made this an extraordinarily lucrative center of trade. And we have evidence for this from the early second millennium BC, not only from the city of Ashur, but also from the city of Mari, here on the great bend of the Euphrates, that lay astride really important trade networks connecting the northern Euphrates Valley with the south and connecting Mesopotamia with the eastern Mediterranean coastline. In fact, there are thousands of texts from the royal archives in the city of Mari that survive. They survive, by the way, as is so often the case with our archaeological material, because of terrible tragedies committed by our ancient counterparts. Hammurabi of Babylon, when he conquered the city of Mari, burned down the palace and baked the royal archives into permanence so that we have them. Those royal archives, by the way, are so detailed that there's a wonderful text from the ancient city of Mari in which the king of Mari, who's out of town, sends a letter to his wife on a clay tablet asking her to remember when they're entertaining foreign dignitaries to serve them iced drinks. The remarkable thing about that, as we all know, Mari in particular is really almost in the middle of the desert. And so how do we explain this? Well, they brought snow and ice down from the Taurus Mountains on the Euphrates rivers, packed onto barges. They brought it into Mari. They packed it underground. It's a huge example in the ancient world, the best one I know of conspicuous consumption. Just so that when they invited people over, they could essentially intimidate them by producing cold drinks and some sort of strange dessert that I imagine must be a kind of sorbet that they were serving at these ancient palaces. Now, we have examples then from the early second millennium BC, from what we usually call the Middle Bronze Age, then from northern Mesopotamia in Mari, in Ashur, and also going back down to the south from the city of Ur. And here, in the interest of time, I'll use one last example. In the city of Ur, in the period of the 19th, 18th centuries BC, we have an enormous amount of evidence, largely because the excavator, the original excavator of Ur, Sir Leonard Woolley, and this is a drawing of the walled city of Ur. Here you see its great monumental buildings. The famous ziggurat of Ur is that dark square building there in the center. But Leonard Woolley also excavated neighborhoods, the places where merchants and other members of a relative urban elite lived in these ancient cities. And we can actually focus in on what happened in even some of the houses of these ancient cities, because the documentary record for Mesopotamia is so rich. And in fact, the one house I'm going to talk about, Woolley called it Number 1 Old Street. He named all of the streets in residential Ur after streets in Oxford, where he lived and taught. So oddly enough, you've got, I think you've got Church Street over here. This is called Paternoster Row in the archaeological productions. Number 1 Old Street, this small house that you see right here, was a place where a merchant lived around 1900 BC, give or take a couple of years. He worked and lived in the city around 4,000 years ago. He lived and owned this particular house. He was a copper trader. In this moment, the copper trade in southern Mesopotamia, I'll go the other way to a less pretty map, but one that shows what I need. Copper trade was centered on the island of Bahrain, which in the ancient text was called Dilmun. And the merchants from Ur would sail down to Bahrain, bringing with them textiles, baskets, silver, and they would trade that for the copper that was so important in Mesopotamia in the Bronze Age. The copper, by the way, came from here on the Oman Peninsula. And our records of this kind of trade are so detailed that we can even see when things are going bad. There's a very famous example, which I think Sam is distributing to you, of a letter that was written to the guy who lived at number 1 Old Street around 1900 BC. It says, "Speak to Eonatsir, thus says Nani. When you came, you said to me, I will give Gimel Sin good copper ingots. You went, but you didn't do what you said. You placed bad copper ingots before my messenger. And you said, if you will take it, take it. If not, go away. What do you take me for? That you treat me with such contempt, that you despise me so." And he goes on and on. He then mentions, among the Dilmun traders, is there anyone who's treated me like you have? Among this professional class of individuals whose knowledge allowed them to undertake these long-distance journeys, the guy who's writing, Nani, is a local merchant reliant on these long-distance merchants. And what he's saying is basically, you promised me good copper, you delivered bad copper. He then says at the end, be aware that from now on I will not accept bad copper from you. In my own courtyard I will myself take and select the ingots. Because you've treated me with contempt, I will inflict grief upon you. So business could be bad 4,000 years ago just as it can be today. The difference is, if folks, and this text even refers directly to the palace. It says here, on your behalf, we've given to the palace 540 kilograms of copper. By the way, let's put that in perspective. 540 kilograms of copper. Yeah, that's a good ton of copper. Now, what's that worth, by the way? It's an enormous fortune. It'd be enough pretty much to purchase the whole neighborhood that Eonatsir lived in. Keep in mind, at this particular time, you could buy a slave for about 8 grams of silver. The 500 kilograms of copper, 540 kilograms of copper at this time, probably worth around, a kilogram of silver. And think then about how many people that buys. Think about the real estate it buys. These are enormous transactions they're talking about. And what this shows us, the end here, because I'll stop in a moment in the interest of time, is how the growth of state authority both facilitates and is facilitated by the growth of commercial authority in these cities where the growing emphasis on certain commodities, copper being an important one in the Bronze Age, these other luxury commodities being important to the elites in these cities, especially their kings, relies on the knowledge that certain professional groups like merchants had, to such an extent that although Eonatsir is subject to all of these nasty threats, and we don't really know what Nani means when he says he will inflict grief upon him, but it can't be good. But the reality is, Eonatsir's business carried on, and he continued doing business with both Nani and Gimel Sin, and this highlights the very complicated relationship in these early cities that commerce, state development, and the formation of larger notions of political community had at a time, because this is right on the eve of the development of Hammurabi's kingdom and the final creation of what becomes the Kingdom of Babylon, the unification of all of southern Mesopotamia into a single political unit that it more or less remains in, and there are ups and downs over time, for the remainder of its independent history. And the way in which the merchants and other professionals in the cities helped to forge the state is ultimately as important as the way in which the kings and other figures that we read about much more prominently attempted to forge those states on their own. And so that we can have questions, I'll stop there.